Hey, welcome everybody. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations and Lekwungen people on whose traditional lands we're holding this conference today. On behalf of Canadian Down Syndrome Society and the Greater Victoria Down Syndrome Society, it's my pleasure to welcome the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation for this great day of education and learning, and I'm sure you guys are going to have just a fantastic day today. I'd like to introduce Sarah Fawcett. Sarah has been a speech-language pathologist, at the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation for 15 years. She's in the final stages of her PhD program at the University of British Columbia, where she's studying family-centered positive behavior support under Dr. Joe Lucyshyn. Her dissertation project involves examining the impact of parent training programs on the behavior of children with Down syndrome, as well as parent stress levels. Please join me in a warm welcome for Susan Fawcett.
Thanks, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? I feel like I sound pretty loud. Welcome on behalf of all of us from the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation. That's taking me a little bit of getting used to because some of you may know we just changed our name from Research Foundation to Resource Foundation because we felt it was a better reflection of what we do and who we are. This photo here just represents how much fun all of us expect you to have today over the course of the day. So if you don't look like this by the end of the day, you're not doing it right. I'm just going to point out the DSRF contingent at the back. Maybe you guys can have a little dance party back there so that everybody, there you go, a wiggle party. There you go. So that everybody knows who you are. You'll be listening to some more of our lovely ladies speaking later on today. I have been the head speech-language pathologist at DSRF for over 15 years now. And I've really recently moved into this position of Director of Therapy, Behavior, and Family Support. And, you know, new titles aside, I'm honestly just a really big fan of people who have Down syndrome. And we have the best jobs where we are. There's just a lot of fun all the time. As all of us who work there can attest, we get to play, we get to dance. Thankfully, the way that kids and adults with Down syndrome learn best is through play and dance and music, so it just makes our jobs even better. I get to also know families over long periods of time, so if we get time, you're going to see a video of a girl named Emma later. And in that video, she's 10, but I started seeing her when she was 2, and she was one of my first kids at DSRF. And we were working on things like, you know, saying the "buh" sound, and, you know, not throwing random objects at her parents' heads, right? And now we work on things like what to do when you feel sad because some of your friends are going away to university, because she's now 17, and of course that's happening to some of her friends. So, you know, it's been really rewarding to work with her and her family that whole time. And, you know, the thing is, though, that sometimes I regret that I've taught kids how to talk because it comes back to bite me. So in the case of Emma, when she was about 10, I pushed her a little too hard in speech therapy session one day. And she got up to leave at the end, and she said, I said, "Bye, Emma." And she said, "Actually, Susan, I just want to let you know, I'm not going to be here next week. I'll be sick." I was like, oh. Might have pushed that a little too hard today. But you know, the one thing I will say that's been a little frustrating along the way is not so much the speech and language stuff. It's been behavioral challenges and mental health issues. And so that's why I've gone back to school to learn about some of those things. And I've been doing a practicum with a clinical psychologist in Vancouver at the Vancouver CBT Center, learning how to help kids and teens who have Down syndrome and mental health issues as well. So that's also been really exciting and rewarding. And I'm just really excited that I get to, you know, share some of what I have learned on my PhD journey so far with you all today. So here's what we're going to cover this morning. The goal of this, you know, first talk is to give you the background information that about students with Down syndrome so that you can really understand why we're recommending a lot of the strategies that you're going to hear about today. You're going to hear probably 3 million strategies by the end of today among all of those wonderful people back there. So, and you want to know why these particular strategies work best for kids with Down syndrome. So we're going to cover just a little bit about the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation itself, for those of you who don't know about us. What is Down syndrome? We're going to start with the strengths of students with Down syndrome as learners and as people, and then get into some of the challenges that they may face in learning situations. And there we're really going to focus on, given that you're all educators here, the cognitive, communication, and behavioral issues. And then I'm going to give you a little sneak peek. I'm really excited about this. You guys are the first audience that's going to hear about my research results. So we'll cover that a little bit later today. So this was us in the beginning, the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation. So we started off as a trailer out the back of Sunny Hill Health Center in Vancouver, and that was almost 25 years ago. We were started by a woman named Jo Mills, who was a physiotherapist, and she worked with little tiny kids, and she noticed that she had places to send kids who had the families of kids who had things like cerebral palsy and autism, but she didn't have anywhere to send the families of the kids with Down syndrome. So being the awesome woman she was, she just started her own resource foundation, and now this is what we look like. I know probably a lot of you live, on this side of the strait, but if you ever get over to Vancouver and you want to come visit us in Burnaby, we would be more than happy to give you a tour. So we have soon to be 5 SLPs and 2 OTs at occupational therapists at DSRF. We also have 4 teachers. We, of course, offer all those therapy programs, and you can read more about us in the booklets and also on our website, so I won't say too much. I think my favorite programs that we offer at DSRF are Taekwondo and Bollywood dancing, because they are just really fun to watch. We see kids of all ages, so right from birth, and I think my oldest student to date was 37 for speech therapy. We are a not-for-profit organization, so parents pay for services. So some kids, and I don't know if anybody is aware of this, but some kids with Down syndrome through the school age years will get funding in BC for all the therapy they need, but by no means do all of them get funding. And so some parents have to pay for services out of pocket. Please refer parents to us, because even if they're coming from here and they just want to come and visit us for a day, we're happy to consult with parents. They can see, a speech therapist and an OT and a teacher and get some really good ideas. And actually you as, educators could come with them too. So you'll see also in your folders, there's my card and Eleanor Stewart, who is our Director of Education Programs and Services at DSRF now. And we're planning to do more presentations and consultations to individual schools coming up in the future, so if you want us to come to you, we might be able to do that as well. Okay, so what is Down syndrome? Just really briefly, it is something you're either born with or you're not. It's a genetic disorder caused by an extra 21st chromosome. So there's 47 chromosomes instead of the usual 46. And then you get all sorts of, fun faces that look like that guy. It occurs approximately in 1 in every 7 to 900 live births and is the most commonly occurring chromosomal disorder. And it is what's known as a random genetic mutation. So that basically means it's not related to gender or race or socioeconomic status or any of those things. So you can see here I know it's really early, maybe take a sip of coffee before you look at this one. It's early in the morning for a chromosome picture. But you can see, there's a bunch of pairs of chromosomes. This is actually a boy, because there's an X and a Y down here. And this is chromosome 21, and you can see that all the other chromosomes are indeed in pairs, but this one has one little extra guy along with it for the ride. So that extra chromosome results in a bunch of things: distinct physical features, health issues, and global developmental delays. And of course, because the last two in that list contribute most to learning difficulties, which is why you're all here. We're going to focus most on those, but just a little bit about the physical differences. So there are lots. A lot of them are on the faces of people with Down syndrome. So they tend to have a flat bridge of their nose. They tend to have more widely spaced and upward slanting eyes, an extra fold of skin around the eyes. They have differences in their feet and their hands. They have a lot of differences in their oral cavity as well, and dentition. The structure of their ears is different inside and out, and short stature as well. So they tend to be on the shorter side of things. So we are going to focus on those other things, but because I relish showing off some of our beautiful students, we can address the physical differences this way. So I'll just run through a few pictures and see if you can spot some of the differences I noted. So that's Lindsay, and this is Reed, and this is Scott, so handsome. And, and this is another Lindsay, actually, and her brother Nathan. So there are similar features across kids with Down syndrome, but of course, they look more like their siblings, right, than they do like one another. So this is, you can tell I was crafting this presentation maybe around Easter time, because we got some Cadbury cream eggs up there. Anytime in my presentations that you see a cake means I want you to, I'm trying to get your attention. So I want you to really pay attention to this next very important message. We are all going to be giving you a lot of information today about characteristics of kids with Down syndrome, but it's really important to remember that there's a tremendous amount of individual variability across the kids with Down syndrome. So by no means is anything going to, apply to every single person, right? Okay, so we're going to move along now to the strengths of kids with Down syndrome. We see this pose a lot at DSRF. I particularly like the combo here of duck face and muscles. It's pretty great. And I would hope this is changing, but people don't always, I feel like they don't talk often enough about the strengths of people with Down syndrome. And there are lots. It's not uncommon, though, for parents to tell me or the other therapists and teachers at DSRF that they leave a doctor's appointment or they leave a meeting at the school and they feel like there's just been a list of negative things that are going on. So I think it's really healthy for all of us to keep the positives in mind and start from that place. And it occurred to me that one of the very first things in an IEP document is a list of the child's strengths, right? So it's just always a good place to start, and I think that's why they crafted them that way, I'm guessing. But that list can help bolster you after a few tough days. It can remind you of how that child tends to learn best, right? If you're kind of feeling stuck teaching a particular concept. So I was thinking what we should do is just put them on the child's t-shirt so that they're readily available. I mean, if this kid was walking towards you and they had this on their t-shirt, then maybe wouldn't that remind you what's important to focus on, right? And give you clues for how this little kidlet learns best. So, I mean, it's a silly idea, but it could work. So this is an example of the salience of strengths that comes from a family with whom I've worked with on a comprehensive behavior plan. So the little boy here has Down syndrome, and at this time he was 6 years old, and he was engaging in some very severe and pervasive problem behavior and in his home, to the point where mom wasn't actually comfortable taking him out of the home anymore. He had stopped going to school. He was, not doing well in any sort of community settings. So it was pretty severe. But despite that behavior, this is a summary of what his mom said when I asked this question: what are the positive contributions your son with Down syndrome has made to your family? So his mother could not say enough here. With a glowing smile, she proudly described his personality as life-loving, resilient, kind, and affectionate. Mom thought that the extra chromosome that gave him Down syndrome also gave him extra personality. She enthusiastically outlined all that he brings to the family, including that he balances them out and that his extroverted, active personality keeps the family going, keeps us busy. Despite the problem behavior, she reported that you can't stay mad at him. I mean, I could definitely agree with that for a lot of the kids we see. And that she often felt his personality lessened the stress in the home. So it was a really good lesson for me as a professional because I just wasn't expecting her to say all of those things, given the severity of the problem behavior that she was facing on a day-to-day basis. And I also just wholeheartedly agreed with everything she said because he was a really delightful young man. So for those of you, actually let's get a quick show of hands. How many people here have already worked with kids with Down syndrome? Oh, most. I should ask it the other way around. How many people are just here to prepare for the inevitable time that they will have a child with Down syndrome that they work with? One? Just one. Oh, a couple. No, there's a few over here too. Okay, so, oh, there we go. So for those of you who have worked with kidlets with Down syndrome, I would love to hear some of the strengths that you have noticed in the kids that you work with and how they've positively impacted your life. So just shout them out.
We love dancing.
Love dancing. Love dancing. Yep.
My daughter's in her 20s now, but she's always loved dancing. She used to be a figure skater. One foot never came off the ice, but her routine was so perfect that she always scored well. And then she's always danced in a typical dance group because she has such a good memory of the routine.
Excellent. That is such a good example. How many parents do we have in here? Oh, we do have quite a few parents too. Okay, great. That's so great. Okay. What else? What are some other strengths that you've noticed? Compassion, yeah.
Compassion for sure, and also my grandson can sing in Spanish,
Oh, wow.
in Catalan, and in English.
Wow. So he's a multilingual singer.
Just by memory.
Oh, that's so great.
Memorizes almost all of the shows of Sesame Street.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Memorizes ahead of time,
Yeah.
and almost at the same exact time as the program goes.
Great.
So great memory.
Great memory for shows and things that are really interesting. Yeah, we're going to come back to that. Any other ones that people have noticed? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's very entertaining. I can picture it, for sure. That's so great. Okay, so those were all fantastic. And along with all those ones you've mentioned, here are just a few more. Actually, a lot of you talked about this musical or dance ability, right? And this, what this lady was saying over here about her daughter being able to participate in typically developing dance classes is it can be pretty common, actually. So they definitely have this they have good musicality, and they can really follow along with music really well. That first one is about, and I'm betting this is going to be familiar to a lot of you too, is that kids with Down syndrome tend to have increased empathy. Okay, so there was somebody who did Connie Kasari and her colleagues did a really great study where they compared kids who were typically developing to kids with Down syndrome, and what they did was they put one adult in a room who was really upset. And the child with Down syndrome was always more likely than the child who was typically developing to go comfort the adult, right? So they're very drawn to people who are either really happy or having a hard time, which is pretty amazing. That's an amazing skill to have as a human being. And then they also tend to be fairly socially motivated, right? And you can use that to your advantage, for sure. You can use all of the things on this list to your advantage. Gesture use is another one. So some of you may have noticed that even though the kids you've worked with don't have, the most developed ability to express themselves via words, they somehow can still tell an entire story because they're really good at acting things out, right? And sort of pointing and making faces, and you somehow get this really complex story even though there wasn't a whole lot of language going on. Their visual learning tends to be stronger, definitely, than their auditory learning, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Their receptive language, particularly for single word vocabulary, vocabulary tends to be strong, and that's kind of their understanding of language. So language expression tends to be difficult, but understanding of language in comparison for most kids with Down syndrome is quite a bit higher. And then certain aspects of literacy development as well, which I would like to show you a little video of. So let's look at Ethan, who is a 3-year-old little dude.
Okay, so first,
Who's ridiculously cute. And what I want you to think about are, what are this kid's strengths? Okay, so I'll show you just like a couple minutes of this video. He's having a little reading session, okay, with his teacher here.
Ethan. Okay, so first, Ethan, what are we gonna do? First read, then story, and then choose. Yeah, you get to choose. So let's look at some new words. This says eggs. 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 Can you put eggs on eggs? Yay! This says meat. Can you put meat on meat? Yay! This says shopping. Shopping. Where's the same? Excellent. And this says bread.
Put it forward a
bread
bit
on
so you
bread.
can see him reading a little book as well.
My lunch. So let's read this. I eat noodles. Good. For lunch. Excellent. What's the next one? I eat yogurt for lunch. Good. Next one.
It goes on. Oh, that was a good place to stop it. What are some of the strengths you notice with this dude? Oh, he loves the attention. The attention was, yeah, very motivated, right, by it. Yeah. What else? And his attention span, you were probably saying too. Yeah. Okay, so attention span and motivated by attention. What else did you notice? Yeah.
He was aware of other people in the room.
Yeah.
And his attention was on task. He wasn't disruptive. He was on task.
Yeah, he was very on task. Okay, what else? Yeah.
His expressive language in terms of sign actually was really good.
It was. He was, as he was reading. Yeah, yeah. So basically, this is a little kitty that has a lot of strengths. I think you can also probably, you might have been thinking he also has a lot of challenges, right? He's not really talking that clearly yet. I will say he's a bit unusual for a 3-year-old with Down syndrome. To sit at a table that long is not something we see a whole lot. But the bottom line here is that it always works to start from a place of strengths, right? Like this is a kid who's 3 and already reading, right? That's an amazing thing, and it's not super unusual for kids with Down syndrome. So start from a place of strength because it will help you figure out what to do about the challenging stuff. And speaking of challenging stuff, you know, yogurt eating can be very challenging. Before I give you my list, given the experience in the room, what are some challenges you have noticed about that kids with Down syndrome face? Perseverance? Yeah? Yes, okay, yep, okay, got it. Yeah, you're giving me a euphemism for stubborn. Yep, okay. Yes, that can definitely happen. Yeah.
I had one OT one time, actually was our cousin-in-law. And we were stubborn to single-mindedly focused.
Right, yeah. Single-mindedly focused, perseverance. Yeah, exactly. Very good. You guys are already reframing it as something more positive, right? Yeah, what are some other challenges?
Frustration when you can't be understood.
Okay.
You're signing and someone doesn't understand your sign or someone doesn't understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And it's, well, I said it to you 3 times, why can't you understand?
Yeah, that's definitely a biggie for sure. Okay, so let's think about some things that make school life and home life harder for kids with Down syndrome. So, the following areas here of development are affected by that extra 21st chromosome, and we're going to go through each of these in turn. So, health, physical sensory, cognition, behavior, mental health, and communication. So basically, each of those has some significant impact, if they're not, fully functioning, on the student's ability to learn academic skills and participate fully in a classroom amongst peers. I always think like our kiddies are up against a lot, but I think they do pretty darn well, all things considered. So first on our list of challenges is medical issues, and actually, I was going to go through this pretty quickly. I still will fairly quickly, but there are parents in the room. Of course, educators aren't necessarily going to be, taking the kids to the doctor to deal with some of these issues. But if you are aware of the potential culprits here, and you have a good relationship with the family, you can have dialogues about, hey, have you considered that there might be this going on, this medical issue? So I bolded a couple here because we run into them a lot. All of these are pretty common, but hearing in particular is a huge issue for kids with Down syndrome. They're really prone to ear infections, but also actually just because of the shape of their middle ears, they're prone to fluid buildup in the middle ear. And what that does is result in something called fluctuating hearing loss. And this often looks like selective listening, right? So on some days, the child appears to not be listening to you and not be following through with your instructions, but the next day they're fine. And that actually it could be a behavioral issue for sure, but it could also be this fluctuating hearing loss. So just making sure that these things are, that this is checked regularly for these kids. There's definitely lots of gastrointestinal issues for kids with Down syndrome. Reflux disorder, constipation is really common because everything is working more slowly in their bodies. And so I just remember we went to a talk in Toronto a little while ago, and there was a doctor there named Dr. Capone, and he's worked with people with Down syndrome for years and years and years and years. And he said something that really stuck out to me, which was that he felt that most people with Down syndrome go through their whole lives dehydrated. So the more you can push water or, fruits and vegetables and things like that that contain water for these kids would be good. And they aren't super keen on drinking water, you may have noticed. But if you can find a fun way to push that with them, it would be really helpful. So we just need to all support parents to be proactive about these issues. As we're going to discuss in a few minutes, these are kids who can't really tell us a lot of the time if any of these things are going on, right, because of expressive language issues. I've got a couple of links to the Canadian Health Watch table and the American Academy of Pediatrics, which are guidelines, very comprehensive guidelines for what should be checked and what should be looked out for in these kids health-wise. Anybody want to guess what we're going to talk about next? Look at these two cuties. It's not a cue for you to have a mid-morning nap. No napping. Okay, so sleep disorders are very common in kids with Down syndrome. Okay, so sleep apnea, we think it's something like upwards of 80% of kids with Down syndrome have at least mild sleep apnea. Does everybody know what sleep apnea is? I feel like I used to give this talk and people didn't know what it was, but now I think it's fairly well known, which is great. So obviously, a poor sleep where you're waking up lots at night and your brain is repeatedly deprived of oxygen is going to affect your next day's behavior and your ability to learn. But you also have to remember that there are cumulative detrimental effects over the course of years as well. If you're consistently sleep deprived, that does not bode well for your development in the long term. So just check with the parents, has the child been assessed for sleep apnea or other sleep disorders? And that should actually be done by age 4. So most of you are probably in elementary or high schools, so definitely these are kids that you're seeing who should have been checked out for this already. And there are effective treatments which are easier to implement if the child is young, right? So a little bit more about health challenges. So nutrition, we notice a lot at DSRF that we have some adult programs there, and you always notice that the lunches of the adults with Down syndrome tend to be really bland foods that are easy to chew. And there are a number of reasons why they tend to prefer those kinds of foods. Oral motor weakness is one, sensory issues, so not enjoying particular tastes or textures, the gastrointestinal issues, and a real preference for sameness, for things to I like to have the same lunch every day. And there's also a strong behavioral element here, which basically means it's a learned pattern of behavior as well. But think about how you feel if you eat foods like goldfish crackers, white pasta, white bread, cheese, yogurt. If you eat a lunch like that, do you feel ready to take on the world after lunch? Are you at optimal learning capacity if you eat a lunch like that? Not so much, right? So it's an important thing to keep in mind for these kids. We want to give them every possible opportunity to do the best, to reach the most of their potential. And that not ideal diet is not a great way to get there. I'd like to steal slides from my coworkers. So this one came from Riley, who's one of our speech therapists back there, who is a total expert in eating and all things feeding related. So if you have questions about that, she's shaking her head now, but she is back there. So basically what this says is that behavior, skill, and sensory issues, along with the child's overall health status, all impact what they eat and how much nutrition they're getting. I think a thing to remember here is, of course, encourage your students to try new things. That would be great, if you're doing like a unit on health or nutrition. If they're able to do that skill-wise, right? You definitely don't want to be giving them celery if they're not able to chew celery. But if they are able to do those things, then it's good to encourage them to do that. I think, though, at the same time, remember that if parents are sending these bland foods, it may be the only thing that they can get their kids to eat, right? And so everybody's just kind of doing their best, right? So keeping that in mind as well, and trying to send messages of encouragement home always. So a few things about physical challenges, and I stole these slides too from Hina, our OT back there. So factors that affect development of gross and fine motor skills. So these are impaired in kids with Down syndrome. Low muscle tone or hypotonicity is one of them, which basically means that they need to exert more effort in order to do an activity. Okay, so they also have decreased strength throughout all the muscles in their body. They have hypermobile joints, decreased activity tolerance and endurance, so they may not last as long in gym class as other kids. That may not be the case for your kid with Down syndrome, though, because lots of them are also very active. It just depends on the individual kidlet, again. And then difficulty maintaining their postural stability, and they may actually fatigue more quickly just from sitting, right? Even sitting takes more effort for these dudes and dudettes. Okay, so sensory challenges, just a little bit about sensory processing. That's your ability to take in and organize and make sense of the sensory information received by the brain and all of your sensory systems, and then respond appropriately. And even though there's only 5 to 16% of the typically developing population who have difficulties with sensory processing, about half of kids with Down syndrome do. If you want to learn more about this, you might be going to Hina's talk later on this morning, and she will be talking quite a lot more about this. But here's just a quick little overview. So kids with sensory processing challenges can kind of fall into either one of these categories for each specific sense. So they can be oversensitive to specific sensory input. So just some examples there. You know, this means that classrooms can be really overstimulating places for kids with Down syndrome. And then on the other side, they might actually need more sensory input. So these are kids who, you know, intentionally fall or bump into objects because they need more input to their sensory systems. But it's kind of it can be quite this sensory thing, I think, is often associated a lot with kids with autism and not so much for kids with Down syndrome, but a bit of a take-home message is that these guys definitely have trouble with that. Yeah?
Does that include flopping or jaw clenching?
Yeah, it can. It definitely can, and hold on to that thought because I'll be talking about some of those behaviors after lunch today. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on now to cognitive and behavioral challenges. So I'm going to talk a little bit, has everybody had coffee now? Because I'm about to show you a picture of a brain, so just want to make sure. Tea, coffee, okay. So neurological underpinnings of cognitive and behavioral challenges in Down syndrome. So there definitely are structural and functional differences that exist in the brains of people with Down syndrome compared to typically developing people. So don't worry too much about the details here, unless you really like brains, like I do. I thought about starting with this picture, because it does kind of underlie everything, but I did want to give you a chance to like settle in first. So kids with Down syndrome and adults tend to have decreased growth in the frontal lobes. So that's this part here, okay? And this is where our ability to plan and organize takes place. And for those of you who have watched the Netflix series Tidying Up, you will, you know, this is where the Marie Kondo organizers in all of you, and I know there are lots of teachers out there who have this capacity. You probably have loads of, you know, neurons firing in your frontal lobes because you really like to have things organized. It's definitely also responsible for our ability to control our impulses, okay? So organization and impulses happen there. Decreased volume in the brainstem and the cerebellum, so that's basically for the basic functions of life support and also balance and coordination. And then differences in temporal lobe and hippocampus structure and function. So the temporal lobe is actually quite responsible for language processing, and the hippocampus, which is buried, you can't actually see it in there, it's kind of in the middle of the brain, is responsible for memory. Okay, so start thinking about those things and how they might actually impact these cognitive and behavioral challenges. So this is what you need to know, okay? So these are the consequences of these brain differences. So there's a reduced ability to process information, particularly auditory information. And if you don't understand something that's going on, or you haven't been able to follow a direction because you didn't hear it all the way and it's not processed by your brain, this might cause an increase in non-compliant behavior, right? Which is definitely something we see a lot. By non-compliance, I mean things like just, you know, sort of, I'm going to keep drinking my coffee even though you'd like me to go over there and do my math. Or juice, I guess it would be for a small child. Or, you know, things like just saying no, right? I don't really want to do that right now, Mrs. So-and-so. And the thing is that teachers give something on the order of 300 to 400 demands, requests, instructions every day, right? And if you're having trouble processing these auditorily, because it's mostly verbal, that's a lot of auditory information. If you also add in things like, you know, hearing loss, fluctuating hearing loss, ear infections, you're in a bit of a pickle with these kids, right? Decreased levels of intrinsic motivation. So this basically means that these kids are not as inherently motivated as the rest of us to learn or do things. And so the consequences here is that learning is harder anyway, but it means that we have to make things more motivating for these kids. Okay, so if you think about your own level of intrinsic motivation, right, your kind of get up and go that you have on the inside of your body that gets you going at the start of a day, it really varies from day to day, right? So some days you wake up and you feel ready to take on the world. Well, maybe some of you have that experience. I can't say that really ever happens to me, but I feel like some people it might happen. There are also lots of days where you lie in bed and you're like, oh man, I just don't think I can do today. You know, it's going to be rough. It's going to be a rough one. There's a lot going on. I just don't know if I can do it. So what if that's how you felt every day? And that's how I try to think about this for kids with Down syndrome, is that's pretty much how they feel all the time. That inherent level of motivation to get up and do things is suppressed. The problems with executive functioning, so this was where those frontal lobes came in. They may be more impulsive or lack the ability to plan their behavior or think ahead of time about its consequences. Okay, so we get a lot of impulsive behavior. What might that look like in a school setting? Running, that's the big one, right? I think I'd like to go see my kindergarten teacher, even though I'm in grade 3 and it's on a different level of the school, but I'd like to see her right now. So I'm gonna go, right? That's the kind of thing that you get, okay? So there's also the other classic one. Does anybody work with kids who just simply say no every single time you ask them to do something, even if it's something they like? Right? It's like this immediate impulsive response. So that's what that is. They're not actually meaning, no, I don't want to do that. It's just the response that comes out right away. So they have a lack of their ability to control that. So for that, you just kind of have to wait it out, right? So memory problems, reduced encoding and consolidation of new information. So encoding is kind of the way information gets written into your brains, and consolidation is the process by which it stays there. And so, you know, how many people would say that their kids and their students with Down syndrome prefer things to be the same? Right? Like routine, I really like my routines, that sort of thing. Okay, so this is why repetition and review and sameness to some degree is beneficial for these kids and why they crave it. They definitely need lots of repetition and review and predictability, which we're going to talk about later on today as well. And then this hyper-awareness of other people is a lot to do with the empathy that I was talking about earlier, but also they just kind of tend to be distracted by people and things that are going on around them, right? Like, what are you guys doing over there, right? Like, that looks kind of fun. It tends to be, you know, it can make working on academic things in a classroom really tough, right? Because there's just so many different noises going on, but there's also so many fun people to look at and figure out what they're all doing. But of course, this last brain difference has an upside too, right? Because it has the empathy. It also may help counteract the intrinsic motivation problem, because these are kids who tend to be really approval seeking of other people. If they really like you, they want to make you happy. They want to see you happy, right? And that can really work to your advantage for sure as teachers and parents. So just a few, we're going to start discussing the behavior of kids with Down syndrome. And sometimes problem behavior in these kids is just problem behavior. And we will get to that. However, up to 30% of kids with Down syndrome may have an additional mental health diagnosis. So autism is a big one. I'm going to talk about that one a little bit more in the next couple of slides. But there's also the other ones to be aware of are things like disruptive behavior disorders. So ADHD is really common in kids with Down syndrome. So just because you have Down syndrome already doesn't mean you can't have these other diagnoses, right? The good news here is that actually the same medications that work for typically developing kids can work quite well for kids with Down syndrome as well, for ADHD or ADD. Oppositional defiant disorder, we haven't seen that one a lot, but it definitely can happen. Anxiety is quite common in kids with Down syndrome. So definitely, especially in the domains of social anxiety and selective mutism. Does anybody have a kitty on there? Yeah, so there's a bunch of hands in here. I mean, we have quite a few at DSRF. So selective mutism in the typically developing population is actually very rare. I think it's only like 1% of people have selective mutism. But in kids with Down syndrome, it's got to be, I don't know the statistic, but it's got to be much more common than that. So, I mean, if you think about it, it's an anxiety disorder, and these are kids who, are having trouble talking as well. So if you put those two things together and they have maybe, a bit of an anxious personality, and then, they're having trouble talking and people don't understand them when they talk, then it makes sense that they might encounter this issue more often. Obsessive compulsive disorder is also quite common in kids with Down syndrome, or more common than in the typically developing population. And depression can be common. Does anybody have a guess about when depression might crop up in these kids? Teens, yeah, right? So there's lots of self-esteem issues in teenagers with Down syndrome, right? Because what ends up happening is that eventually a lot of them will realize that they're not quite the same as the other people in their class, but they want to be the same as the other people in their class, but they have Down syndrome, so they can't be the same. And then you get self-esteem issues that result. And the extreme end of that is getting depressed about it. So those are some things that can happen. Not super common, but again, more common than in the typically developing population. Okay, so a little bit about autism then. In all kids, this is how you diagnose autism. Okay, so basically, in order to receive this diagnosis, a child has to have deficits in social interaction. And, I would argue that's actually the biggest piece. People don't often, they tend to think of autism, I think, more as the sensory challenges and some of the behavioral issues and that kind of thing, but the social piece is the crux of that diagnosis. So restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior or interests is another thing. All the symptoms must be present in early childhood, and those symptoms must limit everyday functioning, otherwise the child doesn't get that diagnosis. So some red flags for autism in children with Down syndrome, because the thing is there's a great deal of overlap. I already told you about some of those sensory things, right, that can happen in kids with Down syndrome without having a diagnosis of autism. But if you take a child with Down syndrome who's, has an intellectual disability and some sensory challenges, that's kind of looking a little bit like a kid with autism already. So there are some things, though, that are typical in kids with autism that are atypical in kids with Down syndrome, and that's why they're on this slide as red flags. So if you see any of these things, talk to the speech therapist at school and just, have a conversation with them about it. So one thing is no interest in communicating with others. I've already mentioned that these are kids who typically tend to be very socially motivated. So if they're completely socially indifferent or prefer to kind of play by themselves off in a corner, then that's a red flag for us, for sure. A general lack of interest in people. If they don't use those really awesome gestures to tell stories, right? If they experience a regression in any of their skills. So kids with Down syndrome are developing more slowly, but they tend to develop at kind of a steady pace. But if they start to lose skills that they already had, that's a sign that autism could be going on. And then there's a few others here. But basically, it's a really complex area and one that's really hard to diagnose in these kids. And even the team who does the diagnosing at Sunny Hill Health Center in Vancouver, they've actually said that they go a lot on instinct when they make this diagnosis in these kids. So, but I think it's good for all of you to be aware of the kinds of things that might maybe make you think that we should at least explore this other diagnosis. So most of the time, though, problem behavior is just problem behavior. However, it's definitely still a problem because it gets in the way, right? It gets in the way of the kids learning. It gets in the way of them getting the most out of their school experience. And so here are some things that research has found with these kids, and definitely we see these things all the time, and I'm sure these are going to look familiar to you as well. So during cognitive work, and this can be either things that are hard or not hard, by the way, kids with Down syndrome show lower levels of task persistence, meaning they don't tend to stick with an activity as long as other kids do. And they have higher levels of off-task behaviors. So they tend to overuse their social skills, okay? And they also engage in what the researchers actually called party tricks, okay? So these are things like, you know, I don't really feel like doing what Susan has for me to do right now, so I'm gonna do this. Look at me, right? And then I'm laughing, and Mom is laughing, and then the kid is out of the room, and Mom and I are like, wait, what happened? Like, we were having such a good time. But they're really masterful at that, right? So they're very good at using party tricks. And I used to, before I read this research, before it came out, I used to call this the ham effect. Does everybody know what I mean by that? Like being a ham, right? Like just kind of hamming things up and being cute and charming and to get out of doing things. And so here are a couple of classic examples of Sam and Isaac being hams. I really like in the Isaac picture, I don't know if you can see it, but look at Mom's face outside my window. She's like, what is this speech therapist teaching my child? I don't think this is good speech therapy. So in official behavioral terms, most problem behavior in students with Down syndrome is either escape motivated, meaning they're trying to get out of a task, or they want attention, right? And it often is a 2-for-1 deal, by the way. But the take-home message here is do not fall for the ham effect during work activities, even though I still find that really hard to do. We're going to move on to communicative challenges now. And we're going to take each one of these in turn. Basically, talking is tough. So people with Down syndrome can have challenges in almost every area of speech and language development. So those cognitive skills, and we've talked about some of those already, expressive language, their speech sound production, or their general intelligibility. Intelligibility is your ability to be understood by other people when you're speaking. And social communication. And it's why we have, I think, 5 SLPs at the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation, because it's just such a hard area for these kids. So cognitive skills, in terms of auditory processing, we've already touched on some of these when discussing the brain differences. But I want to do just a quick little demo here, if everybody's feeling awake enough. So what I want you to do is I want you to get into pairs at your table and first decide who is person A and who is person B, and then I'll give you your next instruction. Okay, so you've got your, I've given you a chance to talk. It's not good. Hey everyone! I didn't give you your instruction yet. You're not supposed to be talking. Okay, there you go. Thanks, Danielle. Thanks. I got my teachers on my side back there. Okay, so here's what you're gonna do. Here's what you're gonna do. Person A, you are going to ask person B a question. It can be whatever question you want, like, do you like Susan's outfit today? You can ask, what are you doing this weekend? You know, what are you gonna do tonight? It doesn't matter to me what you ask, but person B is not going to answer, okay? So person B is going to stare at person A, or look down at their coffee, or look up at the ceiling, or crawl under the table. Maybe don't do that. Actually, don't do that. And person A is going to count to 30 inside their heads before they're allowed to re-ask the question. Okay, so go for it. Okay, so I think everybody's had the chance to ask it again. And now we're all just talking again. Do your teacher thing, guys. Okay, so I first want to ask person A, how did that feel to you? How did it feel? Yeah, typical. Okay, so it probably felt somewhat awkward, right? So what if I now tell you that a lot of students with Down syndrome need up to 30 seconds to process what you have said to them? Okay, so now I'm not going to ask you to give 30 seconds because I think that that's just going to be super awkward for everybody. But if you can try to give your students with Down syndrome 10 seconds, count to 10 in your head before you repeat your verbal demand. That you will probably find that lots of times you don't need to repeat it. But the thing is, our natural instinct, right, as the person A's can probably attest, I told you not to say anything, but you probably wanted to make sure the person heard you, right? You wanted to check in, you wanted to rephrase the question, but now we're just peppering in more auditory information, and the kid had trouble processing the first time you did it. Okay, so you don't want to load information on top of information on top of information is basically the point there. They also, kind of along the same lines, kids with Down syndrome can have trouble with verbal short-term memory. So they tend to not be able to work with verbal information within their memories. Attending skills, those are really variable. So you might find on some days your kid with Down syndrome will attend quite well to activities, and then other days it's like they have a attention span of a gnat, right? Like where it's just sort of, I look at this activity and I'm done with it now. That's enough. So, it's definitely really variable, and it's definitely nowhere near that, Ethan aside, who we saw earlier, it's nowhere near that of typically developing children, for sure. There's definitely issues with reasoning or problem-solving abilities, which of course you can imagine has lots of repercussions for learning. Sequencing and organization. So if you're having trouble with sequencing information, what academic repercussions are going to happen from poor sequencing? Following a story. Yeah, that is absolutely the classic example. You get 5,000 bonus points. Okay, so definitely story comprehension is really adversely affected by poor sequencing skills. And then generalization and maintenance of learned skills. So these are kids you definitely want to, even when you think that they've learned something quite well and they know it quite well, you want to try it out in different scenarios with different people, because you might find that they kind of are able to do the skill with you, but they're not able to do it when you walk out of the room and do it with, Johnny outside the door. So practicing skills in different rooms and with different peers is a really good idea, especially for the social stuff, for sure. So there's just your reminder from this cute little guy to please give me 10 to 30 seconds to think. Okay, so kids with Down syndrome will be delayed in their development of speech and language, and we're going to talk a little bit about expressive language first. So language being the content of what we say, and speech being how we say what we say. Okay, so the development will occur more slowly as well. So these are kids who start talking later, and then even when they do start talking, the development of the talking is slower than other kids. So there are definitely particular difficulties with both individual words and sentence structure for kids with Down syndrome. So decreased use of function words. So those are those kind of little words that are in all of our sentences, like and the and of. Increased number of omitted morphemes. So these are endings of words. So things like the plural ending, the ed ending, those can be quite tricky for them to express. And then decreased MLU, which is a term for mean length of utterance, meaning the average number of words that you say in a sentence. That's definitely quite low in kids with Down syndrome compared to typically developing kids. And I think we've noticed that a lot of kids have trouble going from that, like I can say one word, I can say two words together, but then going from that being able to combine two words into like 3 to 5 to 6 to 7, that tends to be a big jump for a lot of kids with Down syndrome, and it can take a little while for sure. And it may seem like, I just wanted to mention too with the morphemes, you know, it may seem like the ed ending is kind of a small thing, but if you're having a conversation with somebody and they say, I play basketball, right? You don't know if they already played basketball, if they're playing basketball later, or if they're just telling you something general about, you know, something about themselves, like I like to play basketball, right? So if they're missing all those little things consistently, it can actually make conversations really difficult to follow along with. Decreased production of connectives, so things like and or, and then a decreased production of verbs. So these are kids who are notoriously good at labeling objects, okay? So they're really good at like cup and pitcher and chair and mom, right? They can do that really well. But verbs or action words are really tough. And I just wanted to do a quick demo here to show you that verbs are really the meat of our sentences. So I need 2 brave volunteers to come up. One brave volunteer, 2 brave volunteers. Oh, good idea. Okay, so what I would like you ladies to do is, I forgot that wasn't attached to me. So what I want you to do is I want you to, I'm gonna give you this picture, don't show anybody, okay? And I'll give you this picture, okay? And I want you to describe to the whole group what your picture is. Okay, but you cannot use any verbs, no action words at all. Okay, so go for it. You can go first. Lion, joyful, open mouth, mouth. Okay, good. Keep going.
Joe.
Okay. Does anybody have an idea what this picture is? Laughing, okay, so yeah. Okay, there you go. Okay, your turn now.
Music. Tigers. Tails. Happy. Feet.
Okay, I'll put you out of your misery. Any guesses about that one? Dancing? Oh, good. But did you, yeah, nice, there you go. Oh, I didn't actually give you guys the stipulation that you couldn't use gestures, but yeah, you stayed away from it. That was thank you very much for doing that. Please give them a round of applause. So did everybody see how effortful that was? How hard is it to get your message across if you're not using verbs, right? It is really, really tough. We kind of need them in speech. Okay, so thanks very much, brave volunteers. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about speech now. So the shape of the oral cavity in kids with Down syndrome and this low tone make a lot, and as well as a bunch of other things, honestly, make some sounds harder than others to say, and there's a list of them there, that the ones that tend to remain hard for even adults with Down syndrome to pronounce accurately. And so their ability to be understood by others is typically moderately to severely reduced, and that continues into adulthood. Longer words are harder than short ones, so you might notice that they can say the k up really well if they say it just in the word cup. But if you now put that k up in buttercup, it does not come out so clearly, right? So anything that's kind of 2 syllables or more tends to be much harder for them to pronounce. Hearing loss, of course, is common. We've talked about that. And it can be that fluctuating one I was talking about, but there's also a lot of people with Down syndrome who have a permanent hearing loss as well. And so you get some characteristics of deaf speech that result as well. So leaving ending consonants off can happen. And then social communication is definitely an area which is a concern for kids with Down syndrome. But what is the general perception, I think, about the social skills of this population with children compared to, say, kids with autism? It's good, right? Like it's better. Yeah, so, but the thing is, they definitely tend to be more socially motivated on the whole, but there's definitely still, just because they really like communicating with other people and they like other people doesn't mean they're good at it and they have all the skills necessary. Okay, so early on this looks like having trouble with taking turns, although I always hesitate to say that because is that not true of all children when they're really young? Interacting appropriately with peers and greetings, eye contact. Later, kids may continue to have difficulty with eye contact and greetings, and those earlier deficits in turn-taking now surface as inappropriate conversational behavior. And so I don't know if anybody has ever been held captive by a monologue of an adult with Down syndrome, but it's like, ooh, I have a good audience here. You look like you're real nice and you're gonna listen to me. And so they tell you this really lengthy story, but they kind of forget to do things like, you know, asking questions the other way so that both people have a chance to participate. Although again, I think we all know some typically developing adults who also don't have that skill. So tell them to come to DSRF and take one of our social language programs, if you know these people. Topic maintenance can be hard if it's not something they're really into, and elaboration of topics. So being able to kind of, you know, flesh them out and talk more about them. And then they definitely have trouble repairing communication breakdowns too. So when the conversation kind of goes sideways, it's like they just kind of let it go, right? That's what I find most often in our adults is they just kind of let it drop, which is unfortunate, right? But they've learned that that's sort of what they need to do at that point. It's an area, though, where all of you as teachers and educational assistants can have a huge impact for these kids. Because, of course, you're in a scenario where there's multiple opportunities at any point in the day at school for them to be practicing these skills, right? Which is really, really great. And that's a really important role for all of you here. And the point here, too, is that even for people with Down syndrome who are able to demonstrate good speech and language skills, it's definitely important to be able to use those to interact appropriately with other people. Because otherwise, things like relationships, friendships, and getting a job are really tough, right? That's the social piece that's really important. So it's really great that all of you are here today and learning about this. Okay, we're going to do a quick little practical application. So let's look at this via an example. Let's take what we've learned so far this morning about kids with Down syndrome and apply it to a common school scenario. So what very common occurrences during a school day are going to be difficult for children with Down syndrome given the following? So they have impaired memory, reduced ability to process verbal instructions, not able to predict what will happen next, inherently low level of intrinsic motivation, not so able to verbalize wants and needs adequately in any given moment. And then we add to this, they're currently engaged in a preferred activity. Okay, what is going to be problematic here? Excellent, you all get 5,000 bonus points. That is exactly. So this might be getting ready for school in the morning, but actually this could be coming in from recess, or it could be putting shoes on to go on a field trip, or putting lunch things away, right? It looks a little bit like this, right? I feel like I'm feeling the energy that a lot of you can relate to this. So transitions can be notoriously hard for kids with Down syndrome, and they are enormously frustrating for both kids and adults alike, parents, educators, therapists, you name it. So that's why I thought we would, bring up this example. And it's also going to get you, ahead of the talk this afternoon, it's going to get you thinking a little bit about some of the behavioral issues that happen in these kids and what we might be able to do to address them. And so there are definitely behavioral reasons why kids this is kind of what the full picture looks like, why they have trouble transitioning. So a lot of them are what we called setting events, and those are the things that I mentioned already, the low motivation, they're currently engaged in a preferred activity, right? All of those things set the child up for not being able to transition well, okay? And then you add a teacher demand, or an educational assistant demand, or a parent demand. And they say something like, it's time to go to the assembly, right? And the child shouts, no, and runs away. In some way, you get some kind of child problem behavior. You can insert your own there if you like. And so we were talking about that, lots of kids with Down syndrome engage in problem behavior for either the purposes of escape or attention. And when there's a transition at play, it is escape, right? They are trying to delay that transition in some way. So how can this is what we want to happen. So of course we have these things in place to start out with. We can't really do a whole lot about those. The teacher makes a demand, and then look how miraculous this is. The child says, okay, Mr. Gigglesworth, and they stand up and they go. I mean, how awesome would that be? Okay, and then the consequence there is that they are positively reinforced with praise and attention and maybe some kind of reward, right, for transitioning. The thing is, transitions are not an acquisition problem, are they? They're a performance issue, okay? So we don't need to teach the student to physically walk from the classroom to the gym, right? They can do that. They can stand up, they can walk. Do we have to teach them to put down the iPad? No, right? They can actually physically do that. It's just a matter of, we don't need to teach here, we just need to encourage them to engage in those behaviors at the times when we need them to, okay? And there's definitely lots of things we can do about that, which again, we'll get to later on today. So let's look at, though, some common transition error patterns. And I've left this slide blank for possible solutions, because I've given you some possible solutions here, but you might also have things that work really well for you. So you can write down mine, or you can write down the ones that you have found to work really well, and then you can talk about the people at your, with the people at your table about it as well. So not giving enough warning about the impending transition is a big common pitfall for us dealing with transitions as adults. So we definitely need to give a countdown here. Let them know, you have in 5 minutes, we're going to go do this. In 3 minutes, we're going to go do this. In 1 minute, we're going to go do this. So you want to give a bunch of them and use a visual here if you can. Because remember, those auditory things are not going to work all the time. So if you can use one of the time timers, either in the physical form or the one on your iPhone, there's an app for the time timers, that will be really helpful to you. Not telling the child what's happening next. So this is fairly easily resolved through the use of a visual schedule so that they can see what's happening next in a permanent sort of way. Inadvertently communicating your own stress to the child during the transition. So I'm sure we don't mean to do this, but we might look kind of stressed out when we're trying to get kids to do things. Remember that these are kids with increased levels of empathy. So they pick up on your stress in a huge way, and it makes them even less likely to follow along with what you're doing. So we're going to talk about this later today too. A lot of this is just a bit of a teaser for my afternoon talk, I'm not going to lie. Using a neutral face, so stone face is what we like to call this, and a firm, confident tone of voice, even if you're not feeling like that on the inside. It's a fake it till you make it situation, for sure. Telling the child it's time to go and not following through with that. right? So the classic example at DSRF that we all fall prey to all the time is the therapy session ends and we're talking to the parent, and we want to talk to the parent, but the kid is now ready to go because fun time is over, right? And so the mom says, hey, so-and-so, we're going to go in 1 minute, and then she keeps talking to us for 10 minutes, right? And so really, that kid has now found something else to play with in the meantime and has now grown roots, right, through their bum into the floor. So, you know, it makes it a lot harder if you tell them you're going to do something and don't follow through with it, because they learn that you're not going to keep your promise, essentially. And then going from a highly preferred activity to a non-preferred or aversive activity. So something like recess immediately to academic work is difficult, and I'm going to talk about this on the next slide. So we're going to talk about some transition math, okay? So here's what we have. We have a child who is playing with an iPad, okay? And we want them to transition to math worksheets and a Brussels sprouts snack, okay? In formal behavioral language, this kind of transition is called, "Are you kidding me?" Like, that is not going to happen in any universe, okay? So what if we do this, though? What if we start with math worksheets and a nice Brussels sprouts snack, and then we go to the iPad? This one is called, heck yeah. I'll do that. Sounds great. So transition math basically means going from, you don't want to go from a very, very, very activity with lots and lots and lots of pluses to an activity with lots and lots and lots of minuses. Okay, we need definitely, in that first scenario, something to lessen the blow. Okay, so we have iPad, and we have our math worksheets and a Brussels sprout snack. But maybe if we kind of lessen the blow a little bit by putting something slightly preferred in the middle, like maybe we're going to walk like a penguin over to the table, and you get to choose your favorite pencil when we get there. Then this is now, hey, you never know. Stranger things have happened. We might actually just be able to accomplish this. Okay, so we basically don't want to go from 100 to 0 in terms of transitions. So I want you all now to think a bit, just for the last couple of minutes, about how we can utilize strengths in learning situations. So sometimes it's as easy as reframing the negative, and actually a few of you did a beautiful job with this earlier when you were giving, you know, other names to the stubborn label that kids with Down syndrome get a lot. So persistent, and what was the other one? Right, single-mindedly focused. That is excellent. Okay, so, you know, stubborn actually can translate into a really good work ethic. If it's something they're into, they will persist at a task for a long time if it's something they're really motivated by. Okay, so we want to think of it as single-minded focus or persistence instead. So how might you use, well, I want you to talk about this with the people at your table for a couple of minutes. I'll give you one example first. In terms of being socially motivated, I've definitely used that to my advantage many, many times with the adults at the DSRF. I mean, these are adults who have been working on speech and language skills for years and years and years and years, and they're probably kind of done with it at times, right? But we need to keep working on them so that you can get a job, right? You can keep your job. You can get the boyfriend, right? You gotta keep working, or so that your boyfriend can understand you better. Wouldn't it be nice if you guys could understand each other a little bit better, right? So you can use that. So maybe just for a couple minutes, talk with the people at your table, and then I'll get the teachers to do their thing after a couple minutes and stop you from talking. Talk about how you've had success with this, or how you might go forward now and use strengths to address challenges in kids with Down syndrome. Great, thank you. Okay, so just try and keep that. It sounded like people were having some really good, lively discussions. So just try and keep that in your brains today as you move forward throughout the day. I'm sure lots of us will be talking about strengths. I'm going to play a minute of Emma as a 10-year-old. And I want you guys to think about how Emma's strengths and challenges, and we'll just kind of have a quick conversation about that after, and how we might use Emma's strengths to address some of her challenges.
It's a little bit silly, for sure.
I love it on table.
Oh, do you think that's a good idea?
No.
No, probably not, right? Do you want to pull the chair up a bit, though?
Okay, let's do speech.
Okay, let's do speech. Take an egg. Ask me a question.
What are you having for Easter dinner?
Oh, good question. I think I'm going to have a turkey for Easter dinner.
Turkey.
Mm-hmm. What should I have with it?
Ham.
Oh, ham too? Just meat? No vegetables?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay. What are you going to have for Easter dinner?
Ham.
You're going to have ham. Okay, that sounds good.
What is that?
Well, who does it look like?
Rachel.
Oh, Rachel. Uh-huh. Rachel, your classmate, right?
That's me.
Mm-hmm.
She's not in my class anymore.
Oh, she's not in your class anymore? Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
She's in Mrs. Carrot's class.
I see. Oh, that's right.
Okay, and Amber is at Mr. Hogan's.
Oh, okay. Mr. Hogan's class. And whose class are you in?
Mrs. Stanton.
Oh, okay. Okay. Is she nice?
Yes.
Oh, good. I'm really glad. It's always good to have a nice teacher, right?
Her
Okay,
name
Emma.
is Mrs. Nichols.
Oh, Mrs. Nichols?
Yes.
Who's Mrs. Nichols?
My teacher.
Oh, that's your teacher. I see. Okay. Okay. I think I got it now. Mrs. Nichols. Okay. What kinds of Easter treats do you like?
Chocolate.
I really like chocolate, the eggs with the caramel inside.
Oh,
I think those are really yummy.
yes.
Yeah. Okay, your turn. You take another one. Here, I'll put that over here.
Mine is pink.
Yeah, you pick. You're gonna pick the pink one.
Yes.
Okay.
Who do you see at Easter?
Oh, I see my family at Easter. This year I only get to see my brother.
What about Easter Bunny?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I see the Easter bunny at Easter for sure.
Okay, I'll stop it there. So what are some of Emma's strengths? Let's start with her strengths. Just shout them out. Reading. Yeah. I heard social here somewhere. Yeah, she was really into conversing with me, for sure. What else? Socially motivated. Yep, absolutely. Sense of humor. You got it. I should have that on that list, actually, because that's pretty common, wouldn't you guys say, for our students to have a pretty great sense of humor. What else? Or maybe tell me some of her challenges now. Fine motor. Somebody said distractible. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the paper was definitely a challenge. I heard somebody say distractible, and actually as this video goes on, she gets more and more distractible. She's sort of like looking at, I try to keep my room fairly, like not a lot going on, but she was looking at everything on my bulletin board and pointing at it and wanting to know what was on the floor and wanting to know who was outside the door, right? And those kinds of things. So how are you going to, and then what about her in terms of her speech and language? Did you find her speech easy to understand or hard? Hard, right? So I was translating for her, but it might have been quite, and actually there was a bit of a communication breakdown, right? I didn't actually understand her teacher's name when she first said it. So she definitely has, weaknesses in that area. But yeah, so her length of sentences were quite good. So this is definitely a kid who has quite strong expressive language for a kid with Down syndrome, yeah. Maybe, yeah, well, it could be like I'd like to talk about what I want to talk about and let's not talk about what we're having for Easter dinner. Yeah, but then that's kind of this single-minded focus, right, of I'd like to just go on this route now. Right? So it could be, I think it's probably a little bit of both. Okay, so if this is a kid who's really distracted in a classroom, what are some ideas you have around that? I mean, this is in a setting with just me, right? So what could we be doing here?
I have a question. When this was with you,
Mm-hmm.
so when you were repeating what she was saying, does that actually help with her language development?
So I was mostly doing that so that when people watched the video, they could understand what she was saying. But yes, it can be. To model it back to them can be a good idea. Yeah, so that they can hear how it's supposed to be said. Yeah, so it was a little bit of both. Yeah. So what would you do if this kid is really distractible in a classroom and has trouble being understood? What kinds of things might you try?
Well, I would want more visual cues.
Visuals, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, just more visual cues and kind of the schedule of what she's doing first to get to the first.
That's right. That would definitely help her keep more focused, for sure. Yeah, and a timer. Like maybe we're going to talk about Easter for 5 minutes. See, you guys are giving me, now I'm going to go back and do my job. I'm going to be better at it because you're actually giving me really good ideas. Okay, so I'm just going to spend the last couple of minutes here telling you a little bit about my research study that I just finished. So what I did was I had 12 families in the study, and all of the families had kids with Down syndrome, and some of the kids actually had a dual diagnosis of autism as well, but they all were 4 to 7 years old, somewhere in that range, and they all were exhibiting mild to moderate problem behavior. Okay, so it was a parent training program that I gave all of the families. And we did it with what's called a randomized controlled trial. So basically 6 families went first. I assessed everybody. 6 families went first. I assessed everybody's behavior and stress levels and things again. And then the second 6 families got the program, okay? So, I mean, the point of the program was to reduce problem behavior in the kids and hopefully help the parents' stress levels a little bit. And they learned PBS strategies, so positive behavior support strategies, much like some of the ones you're going to be learning later today. They also learned a mindfulness practice and how to think more helpfully about their child's behavior. So that's kind of like some cognitive behavior therapy stuff. The program did have, the results are still kind of coming in, but it definitely did have a positive impact on child problem behavior, adaptive behavior, and parent use of strategies. And for those of you who know people in the Lower Mainland, or if you're from the Lower Mainland, this is, you know, it wasn't just kind of a one-time thing. I wanted to see if it works so that hopefully we can do this to help prevent problem behavior in kids with Down syndrome. So it's going to run again in January of 2020, hopefully. And I'm going to show you some before and after clips in the session after lunch. But I do want to just show you, there's lots of females here. How many of you really enjoy diamonds? Right? So diamonds are actually better when they're your research results, because what this shows is that the kids were engaging in lots of problem behavior here. So here's the kids who got the program first. This is the experimental group. Okay, so they had the program after this time 1. I assessed everybody again at time 2. These guys had the program and their problem behavior dropped by that much. These guys, what can you see here? They're actually getting worse. Okay, so the control group actually got worse while these lucky parents got the program first, right? And then what was really cool was that by time 3, this group, who hadn't actually had any more intervention, got a little bit better, meaning that the parents were just getting better at using the skills, right? And then this group, who now had the program, have now come down to almost meet these guys. Okay, so this is very exciting for me for obvious reasons, but more exciting for the families, right, who are now having a slightly easier time with some aspects of their life. Okay, so last little thing here, a cake. Okay, so I know it's early in the day for take-home messages, but here are some messages. Please try to give positive messages to parents, even on hard days, because that's when they need to hear them the most. Keep in mind that just about everything is harder for kids with Down syndrome, and on top of that, they aren't as inherently motivated as the rest of us to, get up and do things and to learn. And then strive to keep the child's strengths at the forefront of your mind and always work from that place. And just try to build in play and fun wherever you can. And that's it. So you guys are off on break now. Here's a few resources for you as well. Thanks so much.